So I've been in the National Park Service since September, and I know when you come into an organization, it is always better to ask questions than to make statements. Because if you make statements, people can disagree with you. But if you ask questions, then you give people power, because then they get to answer the questions. So I don't have statements. I have questions. And these are the sort of questions I think we're looking at. First of all, John Jarvis's priorities are stewardship, education, workforce, and relevancy. Stewardship in terms of people caring for public lands, education in terms of providing the right kind of educational opportunities for people to learn, workforce, I'll talk about in a minute, and relevancy, that the National Park Service, again, should be relevant in the lives of all Americans, even if they never get to them. So, here are my 10 questions. How will we reduce the imposition of adults into what has historically been the sacred places of children? So, the woods and playgrounds have always been the sacred places of children. That's where children live, that's where children could go to get away from adults, and adults wanted children to go there. You know, my parents didn't want to be with me as much as I want to be with my children. My parents wanted me to leave the house. Now, I'm only now understanding why they wanted me to leave the house. But the issue is there are no more woods, and we have this thing called organized sport, and I believe the health of children has to do with the fact that they don't get engaged in improvisational, spontaneous play anymore. We played every day until we couldn't. We played, so we didn't go to practice for 2.5 hours, right? Or we didn't go to practice for like 1.5 hours. When we went to the woods, we played until we had to come home and eat dinner, and then we went back out in the woods. Or we played until we had to do homework. But now that adults have intruded in the sacred spaces of children, it's affecting their health, but it's also affecting their development. So, whereas people talk about video games and that kind of stuff being bad, I believe the video games have now become the sacred place of children. It's a place where they can go and know they can get away from adults, because I can't stand that stuff. I can't stand the music, I can't stand the lyrics, I can't stand to go in there and see Nicholas shoot this monkey on the rock and blow it up. I can't stand any of that stuff. And so I believe that video games have become the sacred place of children. It is a place they go to get away from adults. How do we identify and transcend the implications of race, class, and culture as we implement strategies to reconnect all Americans, but especially young people, with nature? How do we identify and transcend the implications of race, class, and culture as we implement strategies to reconnect all Americans, but especially young people, with nature? How do we identify and implement the strategies required to eliminate the need for an environmental community? So, I believe, the environmental community is sort of a white upper middle class community, right? How do we create a world in which everybody accepts their responsibility for environmental stewardship, so we don't need an environmental community, okay? How do we reconnect cultures of Americans with their deep and profound ancestral relationships with nature? So if I can explain this a little bit, when I was in my interview, somebody in the interview asked me how we're going to get more African American people to go camping and hiking, and I said, I'm not really interested in that. I mean, I am interested in that.
Thank you.
I don't want you to think. So I'm going somewhere with this. I'm going somewhere with this. But I said the question is deeper than that. You've got cultures of people who historically and ancestrally had profound relationships with nature and a profound understanding with nature. The question becomes, how did those relationships get disrupted? And what disrupted those relationships were slavery, genocide, rural racial violence, and forced labor. If we want to have a conversation about how we reconnect people with nature, I'm willing to have that conversation. And if camping and hiking is a way to do that, then I'm willing to do that, but I'm not willing to do the camping and hiking thing without the understanding that rural racial violence, slavery, genocide, and forced labor has disrupted people's relationships with nature. So how do we fix that? Now, I was just talking to a group of African American kids from the Coleman Academy in Baltimore last week, And I realized that I have a fear of being in the woods with white people, but they don't. They don't, because things have changed, right? But my fear of rural racial violence created a situation where I never took them out into the woods. So I denied them the opportunity to get engaged, and now by virtue of a fear that I had, they're not involved and they don't know how to do that. But it's not because they're afraid, it's because I denied them the opportunity to have that experience based on a fear that was developed in me by growing up in the South at a very, very difficult time. So how do we go about dealing with that? What activities, programs, services do we put in place to get middle and upper class Americans as concerned about and engaged in eliminating the environmental injustices that affect the health and quality of life of poor urban people as they are about old growth, endangered species, the preservation of open space, and climate change? Wow. So how do we get these middle class people who are consistently talking about salmon and endangered species and old growth to understand that the environmental conditions that poor people of color are living in are killing them every day? But they don't seem to be they don't have a sense of urgency about that. They don't have the same sense of urgency that they have about the high-level environmental issues. How do we get poor people to understand the profound impact nature and their environment has on their lives? How do we cooperate in creating threshold experiences that break the restrictive cycles that severely limit recreation and career choice? How does the National Park Service, and this is our own personal problem, I'm amazed at the National Park Service when I talk to people, and if they've been there 25 years, they're a junior person. In other words, people die in these jobs. I mean, it's not unusual for somebody to have been working with the National Park Service for 35 years. Our employees are obviously inspired by the mission of this organization. But the morale survey tells us, or the morale surveys that we have taken tell us that they're not so excited about the organization they work with. So how do we create an organization that is inspiring as the mission and vision of the National Park Service? How do we get our employees to know that we care about them, we care about what they think, we care about how they feel? How can they be as inspired by the workforce as they are by the mission and vision? How do we create a society whose lifestyle and recreation choices are compatible with their environment? And how do we facilitate colliding moral and recreation interests? And kind of what that means in a simplistic form is there are a lot of competing uses, right? There are people who want to jet ski and people who want to swim. There are people who want to hike and people who want to ride horses and mountain bikes. How do we create a situation where we understand how to facilitate that kind of dynamic? And how do we decide where the appropriate places are for people to do that? And finally, how will the National Park Service get our public to appreciate that our historical and cultural units are every bit as inspiring as the jewels of the National Park Service? How do we get, after having studied institutionalized racism, I study the patterns of my speech, and when I'm giving examples about the National Park Service, I'm always talking about parks. But if you go to Port Chicago, if you go to the Frederick Douglass House, if you go to the Hampton Plantation, you are every bit as inspired as you would be if you went to Yosemite and Yellowstone. So how do we get people to understand that all of those things are inspirations for people and that they need to care about all of those things? The reality is the National Park Service tells America's story. And it tells stories about America at its worst, and it tells stories about America at its best. The stories about America at its best gives us pride, and the stories about America as its worst motivates us to understand the promise of democracy and how far we've got to go. So how do we make sure that we don't lose sight of those things? So those are my 10 questions.